Welcome back to another Google AdMob developer tutorial. My name is Justin Malandrucolo, and today I'm going to show you how to integrate the User Messaging Platform SDK, or UMP SDK, into your app on Android. The UMP SDK provides a collection of APIs that you can use to gather consent from your users, which helps you comply with privacy laws and regulations. Let's take a look at the AdMob user interface and see the privacy message I have configured, which the UMP SDK presents, giving your users the ability to consent to how their data is used. A complete integration of the UMP SDK includes the following key steps. I'll walk you through each step with a demo Android Studio project. First, we'll import the SDK, then request for consent information, load and present a privacy message, request ads. I'll show you how to test your integration, then we'll implement a privacy options button, and lastly, I'll talk about how to optimize your integration. So let's jump into a demo. Here I have a simple Android app, and I'm in my build.gradle file in the app. The first thing I'm going to do is jump across to the developer documentation. Under the Install with Gradle section in the Get Started guide, I'm going to copy this dependency. And it's important when you're integrating to use the latest version, which we include here. And sync Gradle. Next step is to request for the most recent consent information. Navigate to your initial activity and create a consent information object that you're going to initialize in onCreate. Set consent information equal to user messaging platform.getConsentInformation, and we can pass in a context. Now that it is initialized, call request consent info update, which requires an activity and consent parameters, so we will initialize one right here. The method has a success listener and a failure listener for any error handling. That's all you need to do to fetch the most up-to-date consent information. Next step is to load and show a consent form. Inside the success listener, type user messaging platform.load and show consent form if required. This method will do one of two things. If consent is required for this user, the SDK loads and shows a consent form. The listener is invoked when the form is dismissed. Or, if consent is not required, it's invoked immediately. At this point, you now have enough information to initialize the Google Mobile Ads SDK and start loading ads. Query consent information.canRequestAds as a layer of verification before making your request. If it returns true, you're good to go. I'm recording this in New York, so I won't see a GDPR consent form. But what if I want to see how my app behaves for users in privacy-regulated regions such as Europe? This is possible with just a few lines of code. Create a debug settings object and configure the settings to include a geography. Add set debug geography and set the value to EEA. Include the debug settings as part of your consent request parameter. Note that debug settings only work on enabled test devices. To enable a test device, run the app and check the logs for consent debug settings, all one word. The log will include an ID that you can extract and include in your debug settings by using add test device hashed ID like so. Now let's run our app. And there we have a consent form. Now that we know how to show a consent form on app launch, we now have to let users modify their consent choices in your app at any time. This is commonly done by adding a button in your app's settings page. If using an options menu, regenerate the menu once load and show if required completes. Your button's visibility can then be determined by checking consent information.privacy options requirement status. If the status is required, the button should be visible. When a user taps on your menu item, show the form using user messaging platform.show privacy options form. There's a listener that is invoked upon user dismissal of the form or if there is an error. Now let's run our app again. And our privacy settings button is now wired up. Lastly, let's talk about optimization for loading ads. Your app will have already gathered consent from returning users, so waiting for request consent info updates listener can delay your ad impression. You can optimize this by attempting to synchronously request ads just after calling request consent info update. Checking the Can Request Ads API in two places ensures an optimal ads experience for new users and returning users. Because we are calling the same code in two places, I am creating a helper function for readability. As part of this optimization, create an atomic boolean to ensure you are only initializing the SDK and loading ads once during the consent gathering process. And there you have it. To learn more, check out the resources in the description below. We have developer samples that go through a proper integration and the developer forum where you can go and ask technical questions. Today, we walk through how to gather consent in your mobile application by fetching consent information and loading a privacy message. We then use that information to help us load ads and enable a privacy settings button. We hope the video was helpful for you. Feel free to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment. And remember to subscribe to AdMob for more technical content.